thanks everybody for being here. And those who have traveled from very far and seeing snow for the first time, I think that's absolutely amazing, so welcome. We're just gonna dive right in. Thank you for being here. Thanks team, Benjamin already did an amazing introduction, so we don't need to go there. We're just gonna dive right in. Do we wanna do a quick round of name and where you're from and the organizations you represent? Okay, I'll start.
Hi everybody, I am Scott Morris. At the Token Jedi, I work with ReFi DAO and Citizen Wallet, and the Commons Hub in Austria are some good ways to triangulate my work. And I have a long-standing background in community currencies. Got started in that about 2009 and have been tracking crypto and using it since about 2017 or so.
I'm Nathan Schneider. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, just up the hill here, and now co-lead the Media Economies Design Lab there. And I live in Boulder. I'm descended from a family of refugees who came to Colorado as settlers while fleeing persecution elsewhere. So I'm really grateful for the acknowledgement we just heard.
My name is Azuraye Wycoff. I run the Yellow Barn Farm up north and grew up here in Boulder. I manage a lot of the economics and social design that we are piloting at Yellow Barn in partnership with Drylands Agroecology Research, focusing on regenerative agriculture.
Hi everyone, my name is Damaris Njoroge. I am the Operations Director at Grassroots Economics Foundation. We are based in the coastal part of Kenya and working with communities all over Kenya, working on commitment pooling and economic protocol inspired by indigenous wisdom. We'll talk more about that today. Thanks.
Hey, I'm Will Ruddick. I was a student here at CU Boulder doing my PhD in physics, and I heard about something called econophysics, and it really just shot me out of the stratosphere and eventually into Kenya to join Jambi and lots of communities there. And happy to be back here. I haven't been here in 20 years, and so it's great to be back in Boulder. It feels like I'm kind of back home. I was like, oh, there's me, and my uncle and my cousins, and so it's great to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Oh, you need to miss. Thank you all so much. And I'm Crystal Street with Journo DAO. I'm a founding member there. I live in Longmont. Came to Colorado to attend Naropa to study yoga. So here we are. I've been in crypto since 2017, so have seen all of the cycles of our ecosystems. So this panel, you all are very brilliant, active, engaged community builders. So we could literally talk for probably 4 or 5 hours. So I'm gonna try and keep it succinct. I have a list of questions, but I also want this to be a fluid conversation. So just take it where it wants to go. So let's get started. Over hundreds of years, the Global South and our indigenous cultures have cultivated and maintained deeply interpersonal economic relationships based on trust, communal dialogue, consensus building, and that human connection that's essential for healthy, localized monetary systems. When Bitcoin first surfaced, some scholars feared that the anonymity of crypto could sever that connection for money, creating mechanisms of separation. And all of our society now has this inherent separation that's just thriving in everything. So how do we introduce blockchain infrastructures to hyper-local communities while also preserving that essential connection to our humanity?
I've got the mic. Oh, sorry. Gosh, it's a lot there. There's a lot to the technology where you have an environment that has a memory system. There's something around authentication to know who's who. There's, within memory you have reputation. You have an execution layer, which means that if you create agreements, there's some transparency of following those agreements. And those are all things that would be in a community. Right, that's a normal human environment. It has those components in it. Like the memory system is in our brains, right? We know each other. We can see you're from this family. You can have agreements that you follow, right? So there's this structure there. Within that structure, the creation of agreements is something that is quite natural and beautiful, and I think I'll pass to Jambi, but we've seen communities expressing these forms of resource sharing, cooperative agreements, going back to really, really, as ancient as we can possibly imagine, kind of protocols that seem to be there. And so, for me, I see blockchain as a medium that we can express these really beautiful ancient forms of resource coordination within them. And I think we're also really actively pursuing a lot more local node, local bioregional blockchain system like Nostr, like things that are much more peer-to-peer, and using blockchain as a consensus layer within those networks that connect different groups together.
Yeah, I would also want to add on to what Will has said, to also say that, especially in Kenya, we're not really reinventing anything. We're just adding on technology to exactly what has been happening and what is still happening. So even with the communities, as they meet and share their commitments with one another and use blockchain to transfer, it is just recording what they're doing and giving a value to the commitments they're sharing with one another. Yeah.
Something I've been really fascinated with once we started Yellow Barn was the concept of Dunbar's number of 150, and really trying to design our social systems around that, of that each person has around 150 relationships that they can really maintain and hold deep trust with. And especially in today's globalized world, those relationships can be global. They can be all over the world. And technology is that unifying force that allows us to see those relationships that are all over the place. But there is a really key point around proximity, around who you can actually see in terms of frequency day to day. So it's been really fascinating to watch these land systems and the social systems and the economic systems all kind of start to develop together and present themselves. And so much of that is reliant on trust. Who are you interacting with day to day? And something I found very fascinating, and I'm trying to integrate into the agricultural world, is the idea of Bitcoin and Nostr and these platforms that so marry up with our own ethos around sovereignty and what it really means to be in relationship to each other and actually knowing where your resource flows. And getting farmers to understand what it might mean to accept Bitcoin for meat or something like that has been a really interesting journey. I can't say that we're quite up and running with all of it, but we've kind of started thinking about having like a treasury of Bitcoin that we can actually start either creating a local currency that's pegged to that has real value, and creating an insulated economy within the farm ecosystem. So any of the services or products you might buy can be done with this local currency. So very much related to trust.
Yeah, I first encountered the Ethereum white paper in early 2014 when I was on a book tour for a book about the social movements that came up in 2011, 2012, Occupy Wall Street, the uprisings in the Middle East and beyond. And I saw the book was all about like the democratic experimentation that was going on in those spaces, in those communities. And by that point, that experimentation had been lost because the physical spaces were lost. And the digital spaces that people have been relying on were not equipped to enable that experimentation to continue. And so what I had seen, what I had gotten to see through those movements had disappeared, at least from my view. And I thought this technology could be a starting point for continuing that kind of experimentation. But it could also be a tool for a lot of other things. For some very dark sides of human nature. And I think we're seeing a lot of that today, and we are very much in the middle of a contest over this technology and what it can mean. This takes me back to, the kind of struggles that were going on in this land 100, 130 years ago. In 1892, forgive me, in 1892, the state of Colorado elected a governor from the Populist Party, the original Populists, a third party that was built out of an alliance between urban workers and farmers. They built on a practice of organizing workers and organizing rural cooperatives, building a movement that created institutions like CoBank down in Denver, a over $130 billion cooperative bank that enabled the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, which was how the farms at my grandfather grew up on finally got electricity. And so we have a long legacy here of building decentralized, community-owned infrastructures. But you have to struggle for it, and you have to do it intentionally. The technology won't do it for you. And that's what those people understood. They worked for decades and decades to make sure that they were building democratically, not autocratically. And at the same time, struggles over money and the nature of value were at the heart of it. You know, the speech with which William Jennings Bryan tried to co-opt that populist party for the Democrats was the Cross of Gold speech. The question of what counted as money, gold, silver, you know, our mountains are full of ghost towns that were made ghost towns by the demonetization of silver. And so the question of what counted as value was at the heart of that movement as well. And so there's so many parallels that we are reliving today, especially as the policy situation is changing around this technology that we're gathering with. But there are no guarantees about what ends up happening with this. And I think we need to learn from not only legacies in places like this, but around the world, where there's so much to learn from about how to build the truly, you know, community-centered, accountable economies we need.
Dang. We're not going to hear about the Electrification Act of 1936 in my comments. I'm very sorry to disappoint.
Okay,
but
I'll bring him back.
Thank you. I'm really hoping so. Yeah. Let's see. So to me, it's about, you know, first off, what is money? I really prefer Bernard Lietaire's definition of what money is as an agreement within a community to use something as a medium of exchange. And I like this definition because it's very functional. It includes all the key ingredients, right? We've got the community, and it's an agreement that is like doing the heavy work there. And then a means of exchange around what, right? Around using the resources that we have available to accomplish the shared purposes that we have together. And so it becomes a collective question of why and purpose, and what is it that we need to have more of, and where is the pain in society that we want to be alleviating, you know, and we get to come to those questions afresh, right, rather than being stuck in the legacy infrastructures and systems and governances that are clearly separated, have a different set of priorities than we do. So these kinds of systems provide us new avenues to express where those priorities are and provide us with enabling infrastructure to then take action around that by putting our own resources behind that through mechanisms like commitment pooling. And then, you know, you have community currencies there that then just amplify those impacts by keeping that currency circulating in the community time and time again, so that you get 10 times, 20 times the performance of state fiat currency in the same period. So it's what becomes really incredible is the way that you can take those kinds of benefits and translate those into, you know, incredible value propositions like what I've heard you've got going on with the farm that are very compelling for community members to engage, because they see that their bottom line is going to benefit by participating, and they're going to feel more valued as a human because you bothered to care and bothered to ask them and bothered to want to help their business, you know, like that's what it's about for me. I think that the common wealth building as the common bond.
Nice. Very good. You kind of also just answered the question I was going to ask. So, no, that's good. We'll lead right into it. So since a few of you touched on what, you know, counted as value and redefining money, you know, fiat currencies are collapsing or transforming or transitioning, whatever you want to call it. What is the biggest pushback when you work with local economies and local businesses or city councils? What is the first reaction when you're beginning this conversation? Because narrative and language is such a barrier besides the tech. And then when you get into the tech conversation, it's like whoosh. So what is the biggest challenge that you're seeing, and how do you solve that challenge?
My experience in working with local business owners, so I'll just tackle that front, is they don't understand what they're going to do with this stuff, right? They're like, okay, so you're talking to me about some token, right, to be polite about it, right? What am I going to do with this stuff, you know? And most people's preconceptions and prior experience of crypto have been just, it's a nonstop scam town. So they don't have a chance to see how we're able to build more like value sovereign systems on that same infrastructure, right, without it being a scam. So you have to be really clear about the value propositions for their participation and how, there are use cases for them to utilize the system to do things that they can't do already. So it really has to be about that additional utility, and as Benjamin alluded to earlier, spoke to, was the expressive capacity, right? Getting them to understand that participating in these systems, right, is an act of solidarity and has compounding effects, right, all around the community.
I encounter two things. One is, compared, for instance, to that 19th century world, we live in a weird bubble here where we think of money and value as more stable than it really is, because we live in a bubble created by the world's most powerful military and other kinds of forms of global power. We impose instability elsewhere in the world in order to produce an illusion of stability here. And so a lot of people are used to money as being one thing that's relatively stable. We saw a little bit of disruption in the context of, the last few years, and you saw how shaky that got people. So that sense that money could even be a thing that you change, and that you reimagine and that you reconfigure is something that many of us are not used to. Whereas in the late 19th century, people were very aware that this was possible, and that's why the populists called for state banks, democratic control of the money system, this sort of thing. The second piece there is, I think there is also a recognition that the populists did win in certain respects. The U.S. money system is designed around a kind of social purpose. It's a very limited one, but the Federal Reserve has to care about inflation and unemployment. That's its charter. Bitcoin doesn't. Bitcoin goes up and down and up and down. Ethereum goes up and down and up and down. All of these current things go up and down, except the ones that are stable because of, and then explode, right? And I think people see that and they recognize this doesn't have my best interests at heart. This is the same reason the populists were suspicious of, the gold bugs of the late 19th century, who were very interested in the gold standard because they knew that gold standard didn't take their lives and their interests into account. And that's why they demanded democratic money. I think, we have to really be able to draw those lines and make sure that if we're reconfiguring value systems, we are taking seriously people's real expectations that a value system is going to care about its effect on their lives rather than, abstract kind of market systems that they have no control over and that aren't going to care if they lose a job or they're suddenly not able to put food on the table.
A lot for us about changing the narrative has been around the words we're using. So much of that really has to come from shared language. And when you're talking to people in the agricultural world, you can't just talk about money and Bitcoin. And I think, generally, probably for most of us in today's world, we have a really damaged relationship with money. There's a lot of pain around those topics and those conversations, and even bringing up the word money, especially in just the world that I come from, it's like everyone just contracts and they don't want to go there, let alone being able to really get down to the root of what is truly value. And our base economic system is actually, the foundation is based on labor. It's based on our bodies and our physical capability of creating something. And I think coming back to that always feels really critical. All the other stuff is kind of extraneous from that. But, this kind of reminded me of, I was traveling in New Zealand, and this was actually really when I learned about Bitcoin and got a really beautiful deep dive from some brilliant minds in that world. And as I had been traveling through New Zealand, I had been staying with a couple different people. And I kept thinking, man, I really wish that I had brought some seeds from the farm to be able to gift them, and just like a beautiful gesture to, share something from my culture. And after I came back from this little Bitcoin summit I got to go to, I revisited all those people and I helped them set up a Lightning wallet, and I sent them a little bit of Bitcoin, and I said, you know what, these are the seeds that I can give. These are the little seeds that can get planted, and just asking people, just hold on to these, just plant them and just watch them grow. Don't do anything with them. Don't try to sell them. Don't try to make a buck, but just understand what the value system is, and you can watch that. And something I really found interesting as I started to learn about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin's not fluctuating. It's people's belief systems, and it's the dollars that people are putting in. Bitcoin is constant. And if you actually pegged your value system and started transacting in sats and Bitcoin rather than in the dollars, you actually see that stays pretty static. It's only if you want to take it out of Bitcoin and transfer it back into dollars that you see that volatility. So that was a really interesting mindset shift for me to really understand, is saying, wow, this financial mechanism, something I've really been looking for to get us off the US dollar standard, actually functions a lot like mycelium. It functions a lot more like nature. It's almost like a sponge that can absorb all this excess liquidity we're seeing in the market right now. And once you do that and you're actually pegged to something that is finite rather than infinite, and stop trusting in a third-party agency that can just print dollars that aren't actually pegged to anything of value, you start seeing we can actually hold that value and recognize really what that stems from, and that we can plant those seeds, and that can actually grow and appreciate and create more value as more people come into that ecosystem.
So for us, with the communities that we work with, it goes down also to language. We try so much not to talk about, to call it money. So I'm going to give an example of a group in the Koso, in Kilifi. Kilifi is one of the coastal towns in Kenya. So there's a group called Kiriba. Kiriba, for a long time, they've been meeting to exchange their commitments. So each person has something to offer one another. And before now commitment pooling, before formalizing their commitments, Peter would call upon his neighbors to come and help build a house. And so after the house is built, they would share a meal. And then the next day, they would go to someone else's house and, they would till land. And so now what we're doing is formalizing those commitments. So after the house of Peter has been built, Peter will pay them with his own commitments. So narrows down to language. So whenever they're calling it vouchers, their own commitments, it's now different, for a long time, before, we've had instances of, when you say money, they want to hold it, they want to save it, But when it's vouchers, there's a lot of circulation, which is good for them, There's growth. And I'm sure Will can add more.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's been, over the years, we came in through this route of community currencies and all kinds of, original Bitcoin wallets, and, working with Bancor back with Scott in the day. And what really ended up having a lot of traction is kind of what John B's talking about, where we would go into communities and say, well, first of all, what are you trying to do? If you're a business, what's your vision for the next year or half a year? What are you trying to do? Then looking at their current reality, what kind of resources do they have now? Looking at the tension between those two things and saying, where are you now compared to where you want to be? And then looking around to the community around there and saying, okay, together, you don't have the resources you need right now to get there, but the community does. And then the question was always, instead of introducing currency, the real question was, how did your parents do it? Or how did your grandparents do it? What did they do? And in Kenya, we're talking, 1-2 generations that have experienced currency the way we have it today. And so they've got all these traditions, and we've been diving into those traditions, and that's really been the key to, even just unlocking some of these words. Like Mweria is throughout a lot of the Bantu languages. every culture. We work in refugee camps. We'll end up with Ethiopians, Somalians, Sudanese, Ugandans, all together. They all have this history of these traditions, and they all have totally different names for the same exact tradition. And that tradition, in academia, they like to call it rotational labor associations. There's some basic formulation where you have some kind of pooled resources, even a Bitcoin seed, you can imagine as that. And then the community is essentially taking turns pulling from that. It's very similar to Islamic finance with the Islamic endowments, the WAFC. You start with some seed. That can be dollars. It could be anything that the community can put together, even an individual. And then you have basically people taking turns putting in promises to support the community, to maintain the value of that, like an endowment. And then this rotational cycles around it. And you can end up with a lot of kind of asynchronous like movements of those. And so that structure, this pooling structure, is more of like kind of I think of it as like a yin state. It's a connection between these other things. And these other things, we call them money, vouchers, commitments, IOUs, credit obligations, bus tickets, airtime credits, right? Those are expressions of value. We don't really necessarily want any particular expression of value to become the currency necessarily. We want connection actually between them, and that's been the progression over the last 15 years together of just kind of realizing what we were missing wasn't currencies, it was the connective space. And for people to be able to express as well, like these farmers, we work with quite a few farmers to express commitments for their next season of harvest, for instance. That commitment is a real commitment, and the pool is what gives it relative value now, to be able to exchange that. And when we're working with businesses, we talk about pre-sales, production financing, right? So can Jambi make a commitment against her next cacao harvest? Can that be pre-purchased, right? That commitment now is sitting in a pool that can be taken by the company that needs to do fermentation on her cacao beans, right? And so we're solving kind of supply chain issue problems. We're solving problems where there's, these kind of consumption smoothing problems where it's like, they're gonna have product in a few months. What do they do right now? How do they connect to each other? And that's, in urban areas, we work with gift cards a lot. So we just say, would you like to make a free gift card? Here's a way. We make little ERC20 tokens. That's your gift card. We have a little app where they have gift cards. And then anyone can create a pool that connects those gift cards into other gift cards within the community. So you can swap, and you can have stable coins. And right now we're super heavy. The last year on stable coins has been huge. We can go in and out of national currency instantly in Kenya. Like I can play crypto to pay my gas instantly right now. It's just really amazing in Kenya. It's really, really been a huge change. Yeah.
That's amazing. And you just laid the groundwork for the next question, so thank you. So in a post-growth era, and we can kind of debate where we are in that post-growth, or if we are there yet, we'll have to turn to these local economic frameworks for sustenance and survival, and you just touched on this. And what I'm curious about, since we're in this period of acceleration right now, how can we apply mycelial networks or any relevant aspect of biomimicry to our local economic frameworks to create this more holistic, cyclical, resilient monetary system that you're talking about and that you're all working with?
I'll be brief. The protocols in this kind of pooling algorithm that we've been working on, it basically involve curation of what's valuable around you. That can be dollars, it can be Bitcoin, whatever you find valuable as a community or as an individual. There's a valuation process, like what is the price list there? What is the relative value of those things? That can be pushed out to an algorithm like what Bancor does, or Uniswap, where you have automated relative valuation, or you can set static rates. We start usually with national currency rates because everyone knows them. You have your relative value on national currency of all the stuff in your pool. And then you have limitations on how much any one of those things can be transferred through the network, right? So you kind of de-risk. You wouldn't want, $1 billion worth of Jambi vouchers necessarily. You'd want to balance that across your network. And then you have exchange mechanisms with things like fees, so you can have liquidity fees. So that basic idea, we've been pushing that through folks like who's the one who does value flows? Lynn Foster? Lynn Yeah, and so a lot of folks looking at things like mycelial networks and how do they do similar types of protocols, like what is the fungi doing together with the plants, like what is that transport mechanism look like? So that's been part of that inquiry, and just like getting down to really, really simple protocols on things like, even looking at things like Nostr, like what are the simplest messaging protocols we can use, what's the simplest pooling protocol we can use, and then building on that iteratively.
Yeah, I was going to give the example of the plants, the three sisters, and how it relates to what you're doing now. Like for a long time, our ancestors have been growing the maize, the beans, and the squash together. And the sharing of the nutrients is exactly what you're doing, and exactly what you talked about. And they're helped by the mycorrhizal fungi, like how much of the phosphorus does the squash need, and how much of the nitrogen does the maize need, yeah? So it's the same. And even that is under the ground, on top of the ground, it's the same thing. Like the squash will cover the ground. The maize will offer a nice way. I mean, it will enable the bean to support itself. So it's just the same. And also going to give an example, like on the ground, it's amazing. When you see them doing this together, like groups of women coming together and really putting their resources, offerings in one pool and exchanging with one another, and then eventually seeing different pools exchanging, interacting through a common market day. They meet there and they're like, oh, we are missing this particular offering in our pool. We can get it from this other pool during this market day. It's beautiful on the ground.
We talk a lot about recharging our financial water table, that kind of taking the same principles of water. And, I really get to see this at scale at Yellow Barn with what Drylands Agroecology Research, DAR for short, is doing, is really digging ponds and making sure that water can flow to the ecosystem, and that certain plants are going to need a certain amount of water and different kinds of frequency. And if you think of money in the same way, it's the same principles. And if we have this lake that we're all pooling together, I mean, it's really cool to hear you guys talk about that, because in my mind, it's always just kind of been this metaphor. But to hear that there are mechanisms of people operating like that, that's kind of what I envision is like the next iteration for Yellow Barn, is almost transparency and everyone being able to see these are the ponds and this is the ditch that flows through and this is how resource needs to move, and you can take some water out, but you also need to put water back in. And if we're all taking water out and no one can tell how much water everyone's taking out, the lake dries up and we all suffer. And it's how do you make those transaction streams visible so people can actually understand how resources moving through the ecosystem. And that's, I'm really curious talking to all of you guys is how do we actually make that happen now? We're right at this iteration where so much of what we're talking about now is stacking functions. How do you know that the water can move between all these different businesses that all of us are a part of? So we're all paying each other for services or products or what have you that create these circular functions within the ecosystem. So a good example of that is we have a little compost business called the Picky Pig. And we have little drop-off hubs that we're starting to build throughout Boulder, Longmont, and Lyons. And what that allows us to do is that the community all collectively pays for one of these drop-off bins at a much lower rate than they'd have to pay if they were just having an at-home service. And then that covers our costs of mobilizing a vehicle with 2 people to go pick up that food waste and then bringing that food waste back to the farm. That feeds our pigs, decreases the cost of maintaining the pigs, is a valuable resource for farmers because otherwise they're running around trying to pick up free food, which is never actually free. And that also creates a distribution channel. So I almost look at that as like the artery system that then can bring resource from the farm, that heartbeat essentially, and bring all of that out to the community and do drop-off locations. So this is kind of the example of creating those circular systems that can also tie in the broader community. So yeah, it's been cool.
I'm going to sign up. That sounds awesome. Yeah, I mean, this question reminded me of a moment where I was finishing my last book called Governable Spaces, which is about like democracy on the internet. And I sometimes go on retreats at this Jesuit retreat center south of Denver, and I was walking through their kind of untamed land, and just feeling like so embarrassed, that like here I am thinking about democratic systems and constitutions and structures and whatever, and just looking at the life around me and thinking like, y'all are not doing any of this stuff, and yet look at you, And so I think, to me, the first answer to that question is just a sense of humility. Like we have so much to unlearn, and so much to learn as well. One way that I, in our lab that we're trying to move closer to that is not quite, I think, at the level of biomimicry, but at the very least of beginning to learn much more from the human legacies that we have suppressed, that have been suppressed by different forces in our world, that have been forgotten, that have been erased through genocide and the like. So we've been, and that are still alive and they're still functioning and working, but not honored the way they need to be. And so we have a project going that was actually supported by the Ethereum Foundation, which means a lot around that connection. We call it governance archaeology. Archaeology in the sense of seeing the things that are still around in our world and tracing their origins and their histories and their legacies and honoring them. And so we've been working on collecting wisdom and experience from governance legacies around the world, still very much getting this started, and then trying to help translate those and build reciprocal connections with people who are building, governance designs for our emerging networks. And that is a kind of ecology. And we see in that work, there's so much diversity, there's so much richness in the traditions that we carry in us and that are carried by others in our world. And such a tiny slice of those legacies has been lifted up and said, this is governance, right? This is democracy or whatever. And there's just so much more to learn from. And again, that's a call for humility and for asking questions rather than thinking that we know what the answer is.
So many great points. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this question in no small amount because, as some people might have heard, we came out with a thing called MycoFi, which is this specific sort of provocation. So thank you. Big shout-outs to Kevin Iwaki, to Jeff Emmett and Jessica Zartler, who aren't here with us, but three of us collaborated on the book, and Kevin and Green Pill Network were so kind to sponsor that into existence. So thank you for that. mycofi.earth is our URL where you can go find a signpost to all these other fun things that are popping up. It's become something of an underground movement of people who are enjoying the mushy memes, all right? Including, right, as we discovered completely unexpectedly in Bangkok, there were some Chinese folks from a university there doing some postdoc work and a bunch of PhD students. They had translated the book into Chinese, printed it, and had this like experiential art thing on the invitation of Aya from Ethereum Foundation at this thing. And so we get there and we're like, wait, this is a whole bunch of like MycoFi stuff. Like, what's going on here? And they're like, wait, you guys are the MycoFi guys? We're like, yeah, we did MycoFi. And they're like, we did the Chinese translation for you. Here's this book. We're like, just drop your stuff. Welcome to your spot. It was like, awesome. So really fun, but the origins of MycoFi as a provocation, it came out of the collaborative finance event at the birthplace and the Commons Hub in Austria, mentioned before. Really great place, highly recommend. That we were thinking of like, okay, how can we invite people into an understanding of designing these new systems for resource coordination and allocation in a way that appropriately level sets around the complexity. Right, so it very much is about acknowledging that we are solving these problems or asking these questions in a very rich, complex environment of interwoven relationships and all kinds of resources all around. And that there's no one system that's going to serve all those needs, and that's not even a goal or a desirable outcome, right? But it's going to be multiple pluralistic systems that are all working in tandem, and ideally, working together to create, virtuous cycles in various ways. But the critical thing is that, there's horizontality of it, and there's, interconnectivity across these different systems and a diversity of those systems, catering to different stakeholders around different needs and working around different resources and whatnot. But one of the ways that I also find this helpful is when we start to talk about how are we meeting the needs of today, and recognizing that the language that we've been using around capitalism, communism, etc., creates more problems than it's solving. And so how do we push past that and just acknowledge that the system that we're in, especially here in the U.S. and in the West, we're seeing late-stage capitalism, we're seeing a lot of collapse, we're seeing a lot of decay. And it just so happens that mushrooms treat decay as food, right? So we're composting capitalism. We're out there acknowledging that those are not wasted resources. They haven't gone anywhere. They're still right here. We just need to remetabolize them and put them to work. Myco-fi.
We have about 5 more minutes, maybe one more question, and maybe a few questions from you.
Okay. We could just do this all day. This has been amazing. Thank you all so much. So for the last question, late stage capitalism is collapsing, and I love composting capitalism. That's brilliant. You have a magic wand and the most brilliant regenerative community at your disposal. What economic system would you build at the local level, and where would you start? And you only have 1 minute.
Okay. I think that a robust ecosystem of anarcho-syndicalistic kind of organizations and financing mechanisms could start to work together on a higher order of collaboration and coordination and cooperation with 7 simple steps. What is the pain that we're experiencing, and what does the pleasure look like? Right? Get a sense of where's bad and what is better. Doesn't have to be perfect, just a step in the right direction, a very sort of protopic sort of approach. What are the best ideas we have about handling that pain? Who are the people who are championing the proposals to make changes around that? What are the ways that we're prioritizing those proposals respective to the other ways that we could be allocating scarce resources? Who's allocating resources and how much into those top priorities? Where's the thing that we're doing to make the difference, and how can I help? And then lastly, what is the difference that has been made in our coordination time frame? These are common questions to every co-creative process, and I think we just have to scale up that sort of multi-stakeholder coalition-oriented thing into a semi-automated regenerative financial infrastructure that is just kind of regenerative by default.
I promised I'd bring up the 1936 Rural Electrification Act again, so this is my chance. So that was a time where, farmers like my grandfather, they were not seen as a source of value for investor-owned electric companies. So my grandmother grew up in the city. She had electricity. Grandfather grew up in the country. He grew up essentially a century earlier because they had no electricity. And so for this one problem, which was a huge freaking problem in the United States, the federal government enabled local communities to have capital access to solve their own problem. And they did, in a decade. Massive, massive economic development success that we rarely hear about, right? My proposal is let's just do that for everything. Say that communities who know how to solve a problem they have, who see a problem that's right in front of them every day, have, flows of capital to be able to solve those problems together. That, to me, is the kind of reversal we need. We need to be able to enable communities to solve their own problems, to be creative in ways that currently they really, really aren't able to. And we've seen that in the crypto world, for instance, where there's all this energy and possibility around DAOs and so forth. The stuff you all experienced with DAOs is what we experience with trying to build cooperatives in other sectors than, say, rural electrification. It's that capital can't flow there because of the rules of the system, not because it can't in some principled way. It's because we haven't made the rules to enable that to happen. So I want to learn from those legacies, learn from those incredible success stories, and generalize them and allow us to apply them to everything else.
We're doing it. We're just trying. It's literally just throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. And I think it's kind of really pooling resources. The beauty with the farm is that we're not just farming. We have a lot of little businesses. We are a bunch of different people coming from different perspectives, all thinking about a different way to do something. So I love hearing these ideas of how to prioritize. I think that's actually one of the biggest things, is how do we actually start to shift our priorities as a society towards the things that are these foundational needs, especially around food. And how do we actually start creating regenerative systems that enhance that foundational layer so that everything else can grow from that?
Thank you. I would say let's look back to what our grandparents used to do. Like they grew themselves. How did they manage to grow their physical assets, their natural assets, governance, social, natural, They did it. So we can still do it today. We just need to just look back, learn from them, and, pull in our commitments, our offerings together. We don't need a lot. We just need to work together as a community, grow ourselves from where we are, and then connect the different pools together, and you will see great things happening.
I pass. Well done.
Oh, nice.
I agree.
Perfect. Well, that is it. Thank you all so much. That was, just amazing answers, and thank you for the work that y'all do. It's just beautiful. Thank you so much. And then we're gonna, okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I don't think we have a mic, so just speak loudly.
I can project. Can everyone hear me in the back? I can still use the mic for the recording. So I noticed there was this tension. Obviously, we're here, global forum on Ethereum localism. This tension between the global and local aspects of economics, and I'm especially curious if you all think that what is the role of a global system of value, like what Bitcoin is trying to be, versus a local system of value, like a community currency? Like, is there a tension there? I remember you mentioned having like a Bitcoin reserve and then issuing a local currency backed by it. I'm curious to understand more the roles of a global system of value and local systems of value.
All right, because Bernard Lietaer spoke about this and had a proposal for creating something they called the Terra, which is pre-anything crypto going by that name. Which, just to be clear, okay. But his thing was that we're using specific currencies to denominate value in like international trade contracts, and doing that, just like having certain currencies be your central bank reserve currency that you must have before you can print your own currency, kind of thing, gives a lot of power to that currency and its related systems. So no nation should basically have that kind of advantage. We should have an international unit of account that is only used for denominating value. It's not actually like a tradable currency or a speculative kind of thing. And that would be based on a global basket of commodities, such that in order to be able to manipulate that market, you would literally have to conquer the world kind of situation. So that would provide like a truly sort of stable value thing that's based on something real, and that seems like a nice idea. We could have something like that. I think you could kind of see BRICS as a step in that sort of direction of, okay, at least now we're not just talking about having one reserve currency, but it's multiple reserve currencies. But yeah, as far as the locally defined stuff, my critical concern around this is if the dollar should crash, right, and we have some American experience of hyperinflation or whatever, how could I move to protect the value sovereignty in my community by having currencies that are not necessarily dollar dependent, right, or could be easily separated from that, so that you can have that floating exchange as necessary. And I also came to recognize and appreciate that right out of the gate, that's probably not the kind of thing that you're going to want to go talk to your local business owners about, right? Like, that's not the reason why they're concerned about this. So yeah, I mean, the locally defined value is I think best expressed in a commitment pool sort of format there, because that is the real productive capacity of the members of that community, and that is refreshed on a pretty regular rate. So other things outside of that are going to be more abstracted.
I'm seeing Zach here, and I'm remembering our discussion about heroin and methadone, and of course, right? But So if we imagine national currency as this super addictive thing that we're all extremely dependent on, it's really hard to go cold turkey on that. And if you've ever been on heroin, it's quite hard to stop doing heroin. You need some sort of trickle in to kind of let your body come back into balance and heal. And when we've seen, we look at like really remote village networks, we're doing this kind of form of commitment pooling. Quite often the same sort of thing is happening. Like they valued currency above everything else. I mean, it's the whole colonial system has enforced that. And what we found with like working with Red Cross, because they're trying to dump money on people, and then they want to walk away, and they find like people get upset when they walk away because they like the money, and typical aid kind of problems. And by allowing national currency limited amounts into pools, it's a bit like methadone. So what's happening is that it creates a value. So if I let's say I buy a voucher or a gift card from Jambi's shop. Well, okay, she got some national currency. She's given a commitment. Well, that commitment now can be traded across this entire network. And now she also has access, a credit access now throughout an entire network. But her buy into the system was not to accept a community currency or anything like that. It was just that she got some dollars that she needed, right? Because of that, because of creating this gift card and putting it in the pool, once that gift card's been used in the pool, it's come back to her for something, there's a gap now in the pool. So she can put more gift cards in there to pull out other stuff. And when there's no money in the pool, she can still pull out all the stuff from her neighborhood. And so when the methadone dries up, when the money dries up, she still has the network, and money can still trickle back in once monthly or seasonally, or if Red Cross comes back, or clients come in and want those gift cards. So there's still that connection to national currency, but once it's gone, there's still the connection there before. So I like the methadone kind of angle to it, and yeah, thinking about money as an addictive substance that we're all stuck on. Yeah.
One more? One more? I see a hand in the back. Oh, yes.
Cool, thank you. One of the things we've built into the smart contracts is the option to have the vouchers expire. We also call that demurrage. And as they expire, so like, again, Jambi's made a commitment for something. As it's expiring, she can also choose where those expired vouchers go. So there's kind of a recycling. This could be called a GFEL tax is another term for it. But generally, this goes back into like a community fund, another pool. That as well, we've had local government have access to that as well, and that's been a good way to bring local government into these programs. So there's a built-in tax through expiration, and a bit of that goes to local government. That's been really powerful to working with local governments. Most of them don't collect any form of tax at all, so this is a way that they could help. And then on the stewardship side, like with the Iroquois Confederacy, we've been really, so there's two main traditions in Kenya. One is this kind of heart pump resource flow pooling system, right? So there's this practice of resource coordination and pooling. And then there's this kind of like mind practice, it's just like a governance practice. And you can think of it, the term for it is really just gatherings. Usually you would think of like an African fireside gathering where elders come together. They'll come for different purposes, sometimes across many clans, sometimes just within a household. There's storytelling, there's, retelling of history, educating youth, there's singing, dancing, but then there's things like clearing debts, for instance, or issues with infidelity or anything that's going on in the community. It's a huge piece of that. And so that practice of coming together and forming agreements that guide the heart practice, that guide the resource flows, that's been really key. So you have the resource flow agreement, type of agreements where there's this flow, and then you have the pools, and then you have something that's kind of steering those pools, right? How does the community actually come together and steer that into the next generation and whatnot? So that's been, the last few years has been really wonderful getting into that, yeah.
Okay. No, I just appreciate this question so much because a guide for me around the Iroquois Confederacy legacy has been the artist Amelia Winger Bearskin, who's been a friend and collaborator, and she taught me to think about these smart contracts in relationship to the wampum belt. That would be the representation of something like an agreement, like including the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and just kind of exploring those belts. Also, I've been exploring some of the more recent Indigenous artists' representations of this tradition and the way in which this is a living tradition. Is that it looks it has similarities to a smart contract, but it's different. So similarities is often you would have cowrie beads in these wampum belts, and cowrie beads were like the first global currency, right? These come out of the Indian Ocean, but their presence extended around the world before the age of colonization. And these beads, as a form of money, would kind of anchor the agreement. But when you look at a cowrie belt, you also have to notice what you don't see. You don't see the minute instructions of every aspect of the contract. When I look at that belt, I'm not sure what to see. And that's because I'm not part of the storytelling and cultural tradition out of which that belt comes. And I love that sense that it's in sense sending a message about a different kind of contracting. One, that I think evokes what you just said, which is that it's a contract that requires the community to be cohesive and to be telling the stories of what this belt actually means. And I think sometimes we want to externalize as system people, as bureaucrat, as coders. Coding is my happy place too. I feel you. But we want to put everything in the code. And we forget that actually maybe this will be a more powerful agreement if we don't externalize everything, if we make sure, if the agreement only works as long as we keep our communities strong.
Oh, nice. Yes, very good.
I just wanted to add one other thing that last piece of conversation was bringing up for me is, within this entire process of Yellow Barn over the last couple years, we've gone through many iterations of trying to figure out what our own governance system is and who are we, and there's many ways that you can tie in different ideas to it. And ultimately, we settled on making it into a church. and we call it the Earth Church. And that was such a pivotal change in the way that we were thinking about everything, because I think probably for a lot of us as well, money and religion have been very big triggers. And it was just such a beautiful way for us to actually reframe the way that we're relating to the land, and that our service and our cathedral is to the land, is to all of the infrastructure that helps us create all this abundance. And we ended up actually creating this little business called the stock market, but like corn stock market. And it was such like a tongue-in-cheek play on the actual stock market. And the idea was that the community was pulling together all their resources to actually help cover the collective cost of maintaining the church, essentially. And that everyone's able to get a little bit of the dividends, that come back from a healthy ecosystem. And that could be anything, a little bit of meat or produce, or it's education, it's community meals, it's community spaces. And all of these things coming together were such a beautiful way that we could reframe how we're engaging as community, how we're pooling our resources, instead of everyone saying, well, I only want to pay $8 per pound for a pound of steak. And we're like, stop thinking that way. We can't keep deconstructing things all the way down to these minutiae, and we need to look at it as a holistic system that all interplays, from the water and the animals and everything that else is happening, and that really what we're paying for is the service, is the labor, is the knowledge that it takes to actually maintain an ecosystem like that. And if that's what we're focusing on, it completely changes the narrative of what the economic value is, and we stop emphasizing the commodification of all these things, so we can be back in right relationship with the land and with each other. And just wanted to share that piece.
That was excellent. And what everybody's talking about here is this human layer, and it's necessary to protect that and make sure it gets baked into our technology as we evolve all of this. So thank you all for your work. Absolutely amazing. And
thank you so much to our panelists for kicking off this morning with such a rich and nuanced conversation. I expected nothing less, knowing all of you a little bit, but it's so beautiful to hear all of you in dialogue with each other. It's a dream come true for me, truly. And in the spirit of tending the soil here in Boulder, I'm really grateful that we're able to work with local chefs who are sourcing ingredients from some of the farms in this area, particularly meat this time of year. So if you eat meat, all of the meat that's going to be served this weekend lived on this land, grew up just a few miles north of where we are. And so we got to actually send some cryptocurrency to our chef, who then sent that cryptocurrency to the farmers who grew the food that we're about to eat. And so we are now practicing the embodiment of so many of the conversations that we've been having already. And so we'll have lunch now for about an hour. We'll reconvene here about 1:15. And should be, everything will be written what is in it. If you have dietary restrictions, we have taken care of that for you. So there will be something yummy for all of you to eat. And thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for Crystal. Amazing questions, brilliant insights from all of you. So now let's go enjoy the abundance of this land, and we'll be back in 1 hour.